Hello and welcome. Hi, I'm Dave. This tutorial is part of a beginner's HTML series. I'll be using the Chrome web browser, the Visual Studio Code editor, and the live server extension for Visual Studio Code to view the web page. There are links to these tools, starter code files, and all resources in the description below. So far, the HTML we have created has resulted in one-way communication. But in this lesson, we're going to add a form to our HTML page, which will allow users to send information back to us. And that makes our HTML interactive. I've got Visual Studio Code open here on the left with the starter code for the lesson. And on the right, we're displaying that starter code in the Chrome browser. And I'm using the live server extension to do that. Live server also immediately updates the browser with any changes we make in the code. Adding a form to a web page allows us to gather information from our users. And more specifically, it allows our users to send us information if they choose to. This is exemplified throughout the web with contact forms. So let's add one to our page. Notice I'm near the top of the page around line 13 where the body element starts. And if we come down just a little ways, we find our nav element on line 17. Now here I'm going to highlight the last list item in our unordered list that has planning a vacation, and I'm going to press Shift Alt and the down arrow to just make a copy of that below. Here I'm going to add another anchor, and remember these are for links within the same page. I'm just going to change vacation to contact in our new link, and I'll highlight the planning a vacation and change that to contact me. So now we have made a link that should show up here by our learning HTML and planning a vacation. So I'm going to press Ctrl S to save. And there is our new link. And now we'll want to scroll in Visual Studio Code all the way to the bottom. And maybe I can just grab the bar here and go a little faster. Because after our last article that has the places we do not want to visit on vacation, and we can see that in the browser as well, if I scroll that down, may take just a second to get there, but here we are, places I want to avoid. We want to add our contact form underneath this, but above the footer as well. So underneath this last article, but before the main element closing tag, so I'm on line 170 right now, going to add another HR, a horizontal rule divider, and from there we can start with our article element. I'm going to scroll up just a little to get this closer to the center of the page or a little higher. And then we're going to go ahead and add that ID to the article element. And here we'll need this to match what we put in the anchor link above. So it needs to say contact. From there, let's go ahead and add our header for the heading hierarchy. And this should be an H2 as it's a new article area of our page. So it matches the other article areas. And here I'll put contact me for the title. Now let's put a paragraph with a little description underneath. And so in the paragraph, I'll just put, I'd really like to hear from you. There we go. And now we have a title and we have a bit of a description. And now we're ready to add our form to the article. So let's start out by typing form and pressing tab. Notice an action attribute is automatically added to the form tag. And what we want to put here is where we're sending the information. Usually this would be to our own server, but for this tutorial and just to demonstrate what a form does, we're going to send it to a website that will display the information that we have sent with the form. So let's type https://httpbin.org and then /get. Now that last part, /get, refers to the method we're going to use, and that's the next attribute that we need to add to our form. So method equals get. Likewise, method is often post as well. There can be other values. And we'll see the difference because we will try both of those out before we're finished. Now the contents of forms are mostly labels and inputs, and every input should have a label. So let's start with a label element, and notice it instantly has a for attribute. That for attribute value should match the ID value of the input. So here we're going to put first name because that's what we expect. And then for the label, this is the part that will show on the page, we also want to put first name, and then I'll put a colon. After that, let's go ahead and create an input. And you can also type a colon after the input and type TEXT to get a text input, and then press tab. And notice we automatically have the type for the input filled out as text. And now we have a name attribute and an ID attribute. And these you really want to match. So I'm going to put first name, and I forgot to put camel case here for the label, but I like to use that on these. So let's go first name, and by camel case that means the second word has a capital. So first name with a capital N. And then for the name value, we'll also put first name that matches. And let's do the same with the ID. Now remember, the ID is the one that absolutely needs to match the value of the 4 in the label. This name attribute, though, is how it is identified at the server level. So when we send this information onto the server, the information that is in this input will be labeled with the value that we put in the name attribute. So let's go ahead and save this much and see what we get on our page. We can scroll down and look at our form. It's very basic right now, but you can see the title, Contact Me, and the paragraph, I'd really like to hear from you. And then we have our first name label and our input where the user can type information in this text input. But there are a few more attributes that we can add. So let's add one called a placeholder. Now this lets us display text, but it's not the same as the value, which would actually be what the user enters. So this could just be an example. I'll type the name Jane and save. And now we see Jane in the text input, but it will not be sent with the form. If we click in that input and then start to type, Jane disappears, and now we have a value, an actual value entered. But as soon as I delete the last letter, Jane will reappear. So placeholder is just exactly that. It is holding the place of whatever value will be put in. So oftentimes there is example data in there just to show the user what is expected. We can also add another attribute called autocomplete, and autocomplete doesn't expect a yes or no or true or false like others often do with attributes as far as that goes. This is expecting an on or off. So we're going to turn the autocomplete on, and that means it will remember other inputs that have been entered into this field and suggest those. So if we were to submit the form and then fill it out again later, it might suggest what we previously put in. So that's a preference thing if you want to have autocomplete on or off. Then we can put required. And this will require this field to have information from the user before the form can be submitted. Now notice I said autocomplete didn't use true or false or yes or no. Required does, but we don't really have to set it equal to true like this. We can just say required, because if we put required there, it equals true. And then if we don't have required there, it's obviously false. And the last attribute we'll give this input is autofocus. Now only one element in the form or on the page can actually have autofocus because it can't focus on more than one at once. This will put the focus in that input when the page loads. So I'm going to save, and then if we reload the page, we should see the flashing cursor here. There's focus in there immediately when the page loads, so we can start typing instantly when the page loads in that field. Now I'm going to leave the autofocus here to have it in the source code for you for the lesson. However, with the Contact Us page being at the bottom of the page, it may not be where you'd really want to have autofocus if you were creating a form. Okay, and that completes our first label and input combination for our form. Now I'm going to highlight both of these and press Shift Alt and the down arrow so I can copy this down, and I'm going to change first name. I'll press Control D to highlight every instance of first name, which we have 3, and then arrow to the front of it, and then go 3 letters in and just switch it to last name. So we could change all of those at once. Again, that's Control D, and it will let you select more than one at a time for each time you press Control D. Okay, so now we have last name. We need to change here. That didn't change this instance of it because we had a space between it, so it was not the same as the others. And we don't want a placeholder Jane for last name, so we'll just put Doe. And then autocomplete on. I guess we did it for the other one. That's okay. But remember, only one element or one input can have autofocus on a page. So we need to remove that. Now let's go ahead and save. And you can see our form has both inputs and labels. It doesn't look too great though, does it? They're just all running along one line and then wrapping to the next when it runs out of room. And with that problem, it may be better to wrap our label and input in a block element that creates that line break. So let's use a paragraph. That, once again, better than using a div. A paragraph has just a little more meaning than an empty div, although almost the same in this instance. And you will see some use divs here instead of paragraphs. So we've got a paragraph there. Now let's wrap the label and input for the last name in another paragraph and save. And now let's look at our form. It has a little more space here. This looks a little bit better than before. Okay, let's keep adding to our form. I'm going to scroll up again. We'll get the last name towards the top of the page. I'll highlight the paragraph and everything inside of it, and Shift Alt and the down arrow once again. And now we'll change last name to password. So Control D to select every instance of last name again, and I'm going to type password. So now we've got a for attribute in the label, and then the name and the ID are password. So let's change our last name here to a password value for label, and type text also needs to be changed to password. So this is a different type of input than we used for first name and last name. For placeholder, I'm going to put your secret. And autocomplete is not supported on a password input, so we can remove that. But we do want to go ahead and require a password. So now let's save, and we see our new input down here that says password and has your secret for a placeholder. But now when I start to type into this input, notice it has little dots instead of the text. And actually, let me see if I can just enlarge this a little bit so we can see these better. There we go. So we see little dots here inside of our input. And that is what a password field does. So it doesn't let the user see what is being typed in. Okay, let's scroll up again, and I will highlight the last paragraph with the label and input, Shift Alt and the down arrow to copy. And now we're going to change this one to something different. Let's say this is a phone number. So I'll once again select, well, I just wanted the 3, but it's going to change 5 now because we had password in there so many times. So we can change the label to have a capital P. This is not a type phone though, that doesn't exist. However, type tel does, which is short for telephone. So we'll leave the for attribute on the label, the name attribute, and the ID attribute values all to phone, all lowercase. For placeholder, let's give an example here, and I'm going to put 555-555-5555. And if we wanted to leave it required, we could, but we can add another attribute here too. And I'm going to press Enter just to come down a line for this. It is the pattern attribute. Now, a pattern attribute supports regular expression patterns, and that's almost like learning another programming language. If you're not familiar, I'll at least show you this one that will give a pattern for a phone number like we have shown in the placeholder. So we're saying 0 to 9, so this must only be numerical digits, and then we'll use a curly brace and put the number 3. So it should be 3 numerical digits. Then we'll put the dash, and now I'm going to put the same pattern again because we had 3 more and another dash. And then finally, it's going to be the same pattern again because we want all numbers and only numbers, but this last one should be 4. And so that is a regular expression pattern that would match what you see here for the example. Now, why else would we put the type tel instead of type text or type number? Well, type number has a little different display, and it actually provides arrows that would have you click up and down, and we don't want that. But type tel also on mobile devices should bring up a numeric keypad on the screen instead of an alphanumeric, essentially, with letters. It should just bring up what you would say dial for a phone number. And now that I'm thinking about that, the hyphen might not be available on that numeric pad, so let's just make it simpler and go with all numbers here and remove those hyphens from our pattern too, so it could still match. So let's save this, and now I'll go ahead and copy this down, but we'll look at an example of a number input so we can definitely see the difference. Right now we see the phone input and its input type tel, And really, we don't see anything any different here besides that, because it still allows you to type a hyphen or an underscore or anything else you want in this input, but we're just expecting numbers, and it will have to match this pattern to allow the form to be submitted. So the pattern does enforce what should be entered into that input. And now let's go ahead and highlight phone. I'll press Control D again, and I'm going to change this value to decade. And we've changed the for attribute, the name attribute, and the ID attribute, but the label here that we want the user to see is going to be favorite decade. Now let's change the input type to number. Let's go ahead and just remove all of these attributes, placeholder, pattern, and required. And now let's add a minimum. So we'll set the min to 1950. This is where the range will start. Let's set the max to 2020. And then there is an attribute called step, and that means the interval in between. Essentially, how many years in this case will we be switching between values? And so we'll just move decade by decade, which is 10 years. And then the starting value, so what we want to display, and we'll start with 1980. So let's save this, and now we see our favorite decade input here at the bottom. And when I mouse over, notice a couple of arrows appear. Let me enlarge this one more time. Oh, I enlarged the code instead. Here we go. Let's enlarge the page one more time. Scroll up and look at this form. I'll shrink the code. There we go. And so when I mouse over, we see 1980 displayed, but we get these arrows. So we can arrow down to 1970 all the way to 1950. Then I can't go any further. Likewise, I can go up to 2020 and can't go any higher. So our step interval is working, and our min and max are also working, and it's displaying numbers. And now we're going to look at a very different kind of input. So I'll just start over, and I won't copy everything down, but I will start with a paragraph element again. Inside the paragraph element, we will have a label, and it has a for value. I'll put for coffee, because we'll ask what the user's favorite coffee is. So we'll say favorite coffee with a colon. And now underneath that, instead of an input element, we're going to add what is called a select element. Now notice it still has a name and ID, so we'll name, or we'll assign the values coffee to both of these as well. The ID here still needs to match the for the label, and we'll still have the same name for the input as it's received at the server as well. Now notice we do have a closing select element. And so with that closing select element, notice that's already different than the input that does not have a closing tag for the element. But inside of select, we need to put options. So let's give our first option element here, and it has a value, and we'll set this to regular coffee. But now that's not what the user sees. The user is going to see what we put between the opening option and closing option tags. So here I'm just going to put regular coffee with caps instead of all lowercase. And now for the next option, let's put iced coffee and do the same thing as far as what the user sees. There we go. I need to scroll up just a little more. And let's look at our next option. Let's say this is a latte. I hope I spelled that right. And let's give another option. Let's call this cappuccino. C-A-P-P-U-C-C-I-N-O. There we go. That's a little one I don't think about every day. Whoa, I scrolled because I clicked just a little too far to the right. Sorry about that. Scrolling back down to our cappuccino. There it is. I scrolled way up by mistake. Get to the end of that line, press enter, add one more option here, maybe two. Option, let's put a cortado. And what else could we put? Oh yes, what I like to drink, which is an Americano. So we've got several coffee drinks now in our list, and maybe we should put other. Other's always good there. because there could be something we didn't think of. So let's just put an other selection too. And save. And now if we look at our form over here, we can see the favorite coffee is here with the select menu, and we have to click on the arrow, and then all of our options show, and we can choose. Like I would choose Americano, we could choose other, any one of these options. And the top one is what is showing, but we could decide to show a different one if we set it as selected. So in the options, let's say we want to display latte by default, we would put selected here in the option, and if we save, now it displays latte by default. So you can choose which one displays instead of just the top one. Now our code's looking a little messy here as things started to wrap lines. So let me just expand Visual Studio Code for a little bit, and you can see how this looks much more organized when the lines are not wrapping. Now there's another element we can put in here to help organize our selections. So let's do that, and it's called an option group, and that is an OPT group. So once I tab over, it gives us the closing tag too. I'm going to highlight and Control X to cut. And out of the coffees that we're going to have, because this first group will be coffees, it's just the first two options. So let's close this here. It will reformat as soon as I save. But we also need to put a label attribute, which is different than a label element. So this label attribute on the option group, let's put coffees with a capital C, because you will find out the user will see this value. So now let's save this, and we're not going to look back at the web page yet because we need to put another opt group here for the other coffees. So now that we have that, I'll select the closing tag, and I'm going to put it after Americano. Other doesn't belong to a group, and that's okay too. But let's give another label here for this group, and this will be espresso drinks, and save. Now I'll resize Visual Studio Code, and we can look, we still have our latte selected as the default choice, but now if we expand this, you can see coffees is in bold. We can't choose coffees, I can't choose espresso drinks, but I can choose regular coffee, iced coffee, latte, cappuccino, cortado, Americano, or other. But our list is better organized because we put in those option groups. We can make a couple of other changes too. So let's go back and just look at the code again. And these other changes are actually attributes that we'll add back to this parent select element. So one is multiple, and that means we will be able to select more than one choice. So we could select iced coffee and Americanos. And then we want to put a size value. And this size says how many from the list will display on the page at once. So if we save that, you'll see what I mean by size. Now notice we have 5 values automatically displaying on the page. And notice latte is already selected because we told it to select latte, but we could also hold down the control button and click regular coffee. And now we have 2 selected at once. And I just noticed my typo in the label where I only have 1 E in coffee, so I better fix that. Put the other E in at the end of the word and save. Okay, I'm going to expand Visual Studio Code once again. Now this looks nice on our page and it allows us to select more than one coffee, and that's great, but I want to show another input that we could use for this same type of data. So right now, starting on line 199, I'm going to highlight everything down to 214. Now from the edit menu, I believe there is, yes, toggle a blocked comment, and I do this with Shift, Alt, and the letter A. So I'm going to select all this once again, this paragraph, and press Shift, Alt, and the letter A. And when I do that, notice it comments everything out. So I've kept the code if we want to go back to that, but this is an HTML comment that we have previously gone over in a past lesson, and it just comments the code out for now. So I'm going to paste in another way that we could use this same information and present it to the user. So here's the paste, and let me go ahead and return there so we have the paragraph on a separate line. But notice we have a label. It's for coffee. It says favorite coffee. Now we don't have a select. We have an input type, and it's a text type. And then it has a list attribute, and it says the list is the coffee-list. Then notice we have a data list element, and that ID matches the list attribute of the input, coffee-list. Then I've got some values here that are much like the values that we saw in our select menu. So this is just another example. Now let's save this and go back and look at our page and see what we've got. It looks like a text input now. When I mouse over, notice the arrow. And if I click the arrow, there's our choices that we're getting from the data list. But what is nice about this, if I just click in there, they pop up and I can start typing, and then it just narrows it down. It filters the list to what I started typing. So that's a different type of input that can handle very similar data presentation. So okay, what I'm going to do now is highlight that data list, leave it in the code for you, but comment it out. Again, I pressed Shift, Alt, and the letter A to do that. And I can reverse this comment by doing the same thing. So again, line 199 all the way down to 214, Shift, Alt, and the letter A, and now it is uncommented. And so we've got our original list back with the select, and I'll save that, and you can see that now on our page over here on the right. Okay, I'm going to expand Visual Studio Code again, and now so far we have got fairly good semantics for our form because we are applying a label with the proper for attribute for every type of input that we have, and that's good. But when a form gets large, sometimes it's good to organize it into different sections that say what each part of the form is about. So underneath our form element, the opening tag here, I'm going to type a new tag called fieldset. And now I'm going to go ahead and copy that closing tag for the fieldset and come all the way down to just above our closing of the form as well, because this will be a section where we've asked about the different information such as the name and your favorite coffee and so on. And now inside of this field set we can specify one more element, and this is called legend. It's a lot like a caption, and this is just saying what we're requesting in this section of the form. And I'll put personal info here, and then we can save. Now let's go back and look at our form again, and you can see it's surrounded this section of the form because we're going to add more to it yet. So we just sectioned off part of our form essentially. It's got a square around it, and personal info, the legend, is part of that frame of this section of the form. And clearly this does give some more semantic meaning, it actually conveys meaning in our structure as we define part of the form and what it's about. Okay, let's continue to add to our form now because there's some other types of inputs we want to cover. So let's scroll all the way down by our field set, and now after the field set we'll put in a break, and then we can add a new field set. So inside this field set we can add another legend element, and we're going to say, what is your favorite food? So this section of the form is all about choosing a favorite food. We'll start with a paragraph. Inside this paragraph, let's have an input before the label this time, and this is going to be type radio. Radio inputs are a little different, but let's give it a name attribute, and this will be for food. And now the ID attribute is going to be different than the name this time. So we're going to say tacos. This is going to actually be more like what the value of the input is. And we'll assign the value attribute, and here we'll say tacos as well. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and put the label underneath. And there we can have the for, which it should still match the ID, which is tacos. And then what do we want to show in the label? Well, of course, tacos with a capital T. Okay, now that we've done that, we've created one radio button. So we need to do a couple more so we have other food choices. I know tacos is the proper choice, but we should have a couple of other choices here. So I'm going to just do Shift, Alt, and the down arrow twice. We've copied those down. We're going to leave the name attribute food on all of these. And that's because you should only be able to select one of these. So when we select one, the other choice should not be selected. And that's what we achieve by giving them all the same name for the input. But as far as tacos for the ID and the value, we can change that to pizza. And we, of course, should change pizza here. Oh, and I should have changed the 4 here to pizza as well. So there should be 3. Now this last one, let's go ahead and select all 3 tacos, change it to other, and then here we'll say other as well. Now I should note that if we had an ID of other, we didn't with our option up here. That was separate. That had just the value of other as far as the option, and the name and the ID was coffee. So we're good, but you don't want to double up. You want to make sure you have individual or unique IDs for each input in your form. Okay, now that we've added our new field set with the choices for our favorite foods, let's take a look at that back on our page. So if we scroll up, we've got what is your favorite food? And since they're all in paragraphs, which are their own block elements, they're each on their own line inside of our field set. So we can choose tacos, but then because they all have the same name food, if I choose pizza, tacos is no longer selected and it's only pizza. So you want to make sure out of the radio buttons, they all have the same value for the name attribute. Okay, let's scroll down a little more and let's add another field set, and we'll look at another type of input. Inside this field set, we'll have a legend as well. And here we're going to say, do you have pets? With a question mark. And now for our inputs, they're very similar to radio buttons, but not quite the same. So I'll start out with a paragraph input, and the type is not text, it is checkbox. And then once again, there will be a name, and we'll set this equal to pets. And the ID is going to be equal to dog, and then the value is equal to dog. So you can see the pattern is much like when we were adding radio buttons. Let me expand Visual Studio Code so this will be a little easier. And now we'll go ahead and add a label after that. And the label value will be for dog. And what we will display on the page will be dog as well. So very similar. I'll highlight this. We'll copy this down 3 times. So now we'll continue to have the value pets for each one of these inputs, but the next pet will switch from dog to cat, and we'll put cat here on display as well. And then maybe we want a fish. We'll switch this to fish. And then finally, we could think about doing an other as well. But remember, we can't have an ID that says other here too. We would be doubling up on that. So that could be a problem. Let's say, and select all 3 and say other pet. And from there, we could say other. Because we just need this to be different. The ID specifically needs to be different than any other ID on the page or in the form. Now let's save this and look at the page, and there will be a difference between the radio buttons, because when we ask do you have pets and we have a checkbox, maybe we have a dog and a fish, and we can select more than one at once. A radio button won't let us do that, but a checkbox will. So maybe we have a dog and a frog, so we choose other. You can select as many of these or as few of these as you want to. Okay, let's expand Visual Studio Code again, and we're down to our last input type. So we've covered quite a few today already. Let's add one more field set, and inside of here another legend as well, and let's put send me a note. So inside of this field set, we're only going to have one input, but it's definitely different than the others. This one is going to have a label, and in the for area we'll just put message. And here we'll put your message. And now underneath the label, let's go ahead and add a line break just to give it a little space. And then we'll add our input, which is a text area. This should have a name and an ID, and you can also see it's automatically given columns and rows. So for the name value, we'll put message. Likewise, that should be the same for the ID since it needs to match our for. And for the columns and the rows, let's just leave it to the defaults here that Visual Studio Code gave us. It's 30 columns. That would be how wide it is. and rows, 10 rows would be how deep it is. So now inside the text area here, we could put a value already. And this would be the value or where the user would type, but I don't really want to do that. I want to leave it blank, but we can add some other attributes. So for those attributes, or attribute I should say, let's add a placeholder. And inside of this placeholder, we can go ahead and put type your message here. And then we'll just leave this blank. But if you were to put it here, it would be like a text input setting the value attribute. But you don't really do that for a text area. You would just go ahead and type whatever you wanted to right there, and it would be the value in the text area. So let's save this, and now let's look back at our form again. If we scroll down, we can see an area where we're ready to type a message. Hey, this is my message. There we go. So that you commonly see on a contact us form. You might have an area for the email, for a different message, and so on. But this would be where you would typically type a paragraph. And I just mentioned email. That is another type of input actually besides text and passwords. So you could say it would be a type email. It looks like a text input, but it looks for the @ symbol to make sure it's inside of the input as well. So I did not cover all inputs today, but we covered many of them. And now we have a full form, but we're definitely missing something yet. We have no way to submit our form after we fill it out. So we need to add submit button or buttons at the end. Let's start out with 1. So after that final field set, we'll put in another line break, and then let's put in a button element. Now a button element should have a type. We'll set that equal to submit. Note you might also see a form that has a type, and here we should put submit. There we go. So you might see an input with a type submit, and that can also create a button. The main difference here is that it only takes a text value, and that's what will show up on the button. Inside of a button element, you could actually put more things than just a text value inside of the button element. So that is a big difference. I like to use the button elements overall because, once again, it's a little more semantic here. We're saying it's a button, and then we can just set the type to a submit button. So here inside of the button, I'm going to type submit, and that's what will show up on the button. So let's go ahead and save. And now if I scroll down, we can see our submit button here that is ready. There's another type of button though too, and let's add it to our form. And let's go back and put a type, set this equal to reset. So if we wanted to reset our form and clear out all of the values, it's fairly handy to have a reset button. Now every time I save, it's going back up, but there we go, submit and reset. And submit, when you submit a page, it checks the validation immediately. So notice when I clicked that submit button, it said I needed to fill this value out because it's required, and we didn't put a value in there. So I'll do that again. It instantly takes us up here and says, please fill out this field. So we've got more than one required. Let me put Dave in the first name, go back and click submit again. Notice it takes me to last name and says, please fill out this field. So it's going to do that for every required field until they're all filled out. So we could put in anything in the password field, and I don't think we required anything else. Let's take a look though, maybe we did. Nope, phone number is required. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And let's leave it at that, and it says please match the requested format. It knows we haven't matched yet, so I need one more number. That should be good. Now if I submit, it's submitted. Now let's go ahead and look at this. What are we getting from HTTP bin? And boy, that is bright, but I'm going to make this larger. We see it's labeled as args, which means arguments, what were sent with the form. We didn't have everything filled out yet, but it did send our default value for coffee and decade as well. We didn't have a message, but it did at least show that it was an empty message, and it shows what else we filled out, including the password. Notice that doesn't mean it's encrypted. It just didn't show it to us as we entered it. So we have to consider that if we're sending any sensitive information too. But overall, that is what we got. So we could fill out the rest of the form and see how all of that looks. Let's resize the browser again, Boy, that is bright when we look at that information. But notice when we went back, the information is in all of these other fields, but it's not in the password field. We would have to re-enter that every time, and that's just part of being with the password field. So for favorite coffee, let's choose a couple here. I'm biased. I want to choose Americano because that's my favorite. Tacos is the correct answer here. Do I have pets? Let's go with dog and other because, well, I've got 2 dogs really. And then we've got your message, so I'll just put, hey, this is a message. There we go. Let's submit again. It's going to be bright, I know, but okay, nice, it fits on here. The rest of this down below is headers and just information about how it was submitted with the browser. So that's server information, but this is what we're looking at. Notice now, coffee gave us both values. We got the latte and the Americano. We got decade, first name, oh, and the server sorted this in order of fields, so food comes after first name before last name. There's tacos, last name, and a message, and so on. So we got everything we expected to right there. Let's add one more button to our form, and this one will allow us to do something that we haven't done before, and that is override what we are setting in the actual original form action and method. So this will also be type submit, and you can have more than one submit button per form. And now this, instead of just having an action attribute, will have a form action attribute. And here we can provide a different address to send the information to when we press this button. So I'm going to use a very similar address. It will be to the same website, https://. Let's go ahead and expand Visual Studio Code so we have some more room here. There we go, http://bin.org/post. So we're going to use the post method instead of the get method. And now for the next attribute, instead of just method, this is form method, and we'll set this equal to post. And so on the button itself, instead of submit, I'm going to put post, and we can save. And now this will allow us to submit the same information with a post instead of a submit. Now notice all the information is cleared out because we successfully submitted before, so I need to enter in at least the required information again. And I believe that was the first 4 fields. 79, put a 1 there. We should be good. And now let's go ahead and just press post and see what we get. So we sent it post now to the same website, and you can see from the form, not just args as they were processing with the GET request. However, this is, of course, just for this server. It could be processed differently on a different server, but we have our labels and we have the information from the form. What's important to note is that it says the origin, where it was sent from, and different things here, and it says the URL at the very bottom where it was sent to, and that is what we specified. So now let's look at the same thing if we are to send this information, and I need to put information back inside of the password. I guess it didn't clear out because it was submitted before. I incorrectly said that. It cleared out because we made a change and saved the HTML again, so it reloaded here with live server. But if we scroll to the bottom now and just submit, and this is, remember, is a GET request, not a POST request. Now, of course, this HTTP bin shows this as args up here instead of under the form heading. But once again, we get all of our information. But what I want to show you is when I scroll to the bottom, look at the URL. Now all of our information is shown inside the URL, and that's what happens with a GET request. So you never want to send sensitive information with a GET request, because if we looked up here at this URL, we would see all of the information inside of it. Matter of fact, I'll expand this. It will be bright again. But there is all of our information in the URL, and that's what happens when you send a GET request. Okay, headed back to our form, resize. So now you have added a full contact form to your HTML page, and this is maybe a larger form than you would often add, But overall, we've covered quite a few inputs, but remember to follow the MDN links in the description because there are even more inputs that I didn't have time to cover. Okay, we've reached the end and it's time to validate our page. Let me expand Chrome here, and we've got validate by file upload. We're going to choose a file, and I'm going to be in my lesson 9 and choose the index. You choose the index.html you've been working on. And then we'll click check just to see if we have any errors or if everything validates. So we've got document checking completed, no errors or warnings to show. That's what we want. If you do have errors, it will highlight those and should tell you where they are so you can fix those. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection. And a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you. And thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.